The unique thing about God is that God will oftentimes disguise what is supernatural in something that is natural. That there's this uniqueness about God that's never outlandish, never boisterous, that sometimes God will literally hide something in plain sight. And often what we do is we become so accustomed to the grace of God that we take it for granted. For instance, you're here, it's a little warm, some of you are fanning, some of you are listening, some of you are seeing. And if you're not sensitive to the fact that all of those abilities to move are manifestations of His grace, you'll take them for granted. You assume that you should wake up every morning. But there's a place called the cemetery where that simply is not true. You assume that you should be able to see. And the reality is there are blind people all over the planet. You assume that the facility of an ability, the dexterity of arm, wrist, and fingers that allow you to fan, you assume you should have that. But the truth is there are people who are paralyzed. And some of them went to bed last night whole, and today they can't move. And it's what I mean when I say sometimes we become accustomed to the grace of God, and there is this idea of grace that goes unrecognized and belief that should always accompany it. When Darwin is writing his theses on evolution, Charles Darwin suggests that one of the clearest manifestations, one of the clearest distinctions between man and animals is that man has the ability to believe. Your German Shepherd has no faith in God. The clearest distinction between man and animals is man's capacity to believe, to have faith. And if Darwin is right on this, then it means the opposite of that is that for someone who refuses to believe makes them more equal to beast. And most unlike man. Which is why it's hard for me to understand atheism. Someone who says, I don't believe in God. And Darwin may not be right, but here's what the Bible says: the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. And shaped his life, her life, in a framework as if God does not exist, as if there is no accountability. You know what, I wasn't going to say all this, but do you mind if I take my time and then I'll rush? Some of what has happened to us as a country in terms of our educational system is that because we decided not to maintain a proper perspective on our Creator, who God is, it has produced in us some of what we have now. You see, if you began to teach for decades evolutionary theory, that you, men and women, evolved from an amoeba-like substance from the ocean floor, and that as a single cell you multiplied and suddenly you became man, this hairy-knuckled ape walking up on the shores of some distant ocean. If you teach evolution for decades, eventually you teach people that they're not committed or accountable to a creator. And then you wonder why they kill and shoot each other in school and why you have to have metal detectors. Well, it's because you didn't teach them the proper connection to a creator. And if I don't respect the creator who made me, how can I respect the creature? Come on, this ain't all that deep. Come on, stay with me for a minute. If I don't buy into the creator, how can I respect those made in the creator's image? And we say, well, we don't know where all this comes from. I do. It's this inability to recognize the grace of God and this refusal to believe. And here is something in this text, Mark 6, that is significant because Jesus is going back to Nazareth. When you read Luke's gospel around the 10th chapter, Luke reminds us that he had been there before, and they put him out. They didn't just reject him, they evicted him. Jesus has made a decision to go back to Nazareth, the place where he was rejected, the place where he was put out. And that too is an act of grace, because when the Lord comes back a second time, it says something about his heart towards people. I'm glad that God has not made a decision to throw any of us to the trash heap. I'm glad that God has come back a second time, not just a second time. I'm glad that the Lord has engaged us a second and third and fourth and fifth. You go ahead and fill in the blank. Because if God had done you like you deserved, I mean, you got to love that about God, that in spite of failures, in spite of flaws, he has not abandoned you, and he still wakes you up, still blesses you, still graces you with his presence and his power and relationships. If God had made a decision to kick us to the curb, where would we be? This is why whenever we engage God, we ought to be celebratory and say, Lord, I still want to thank you that even when I was living low, loose, and raggedy, you didn't abandon me. A second time he comes, and in the second time, they are somewhat astonished and adversarial to him in his own hometown. Verse 2 says, the next Sabbath, he began teaching in the synagogue, and many who had heard him were amazed. They asked, where did he get all this wisdom and the power to perform such miracles? And then they scoffed. He's just a carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and his sisters live right here among us. They were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. Isn't it strange how sometimes the things that are common and familiar, you can ignore the greatness that resides in them? Why is it that always that with which we are most familiar seems to be that which we cherish the least? It's a guy married to a woman for decades, and all of a sudden, because he's so familiar, she no longer scratches him where he itches. It's a woman married to a man who, because she is now so familiar, he no longer scratches her where she itches, and they look for things outside when the best thing they have, the one that's been washing, cleaning their drawers for decades, is right in front of them. The one who has gone through highs and lows, through thick and thin, the one who has loved them, prayed for them, walked with them, talked with them, cried with them, labored with them, still in the throes of the fight. Always looking externally outside. And in this text, Jesus has come because now they think they know him. And the truth is, you never know someone as well as you could or should just because you're familiar. Everybody has layers. And there are narratives of our lives that you know nothing about, which is why when you go to a good doctor, before he prescribes a diagnosis, before he prescribes a prescription, gives a clear diagnosis. Because you can go to an ER and present one problem, but there are problems behind the problem that can veil the presenting problem. Am I making sense to you? So that there's a narrative behind the narrative that you must understand in order to understand what's taking place. And here they have reduced him to nothing more than the brother of James and Judas and the brother of his sisters. And listen, they decide to, in a derogatory way, call him a bastard. You see, in the ancient world, genealogy was determined on the basis of one's father, not mother. And so what you would become known as is the son of Joseph, or the son of Abraham, or the son of Isaac. They use a derogatory, socially driven term and call him the carpenter, the son of Mary. Because what they're trying to say is that we know stuff about you. And we know your origins, and we know where you come from. And because we know where you come from, you can't possibly be king because you're too common. You're common because you've got a common trade. You're a carpenter. You're common because you come from a common city called Nazareth. You're common because you come out of a common single mother family, and you can't possibly be any more than common. But when God is in the mix, he takes the common and can turn you into king. That's why you ought not ever let anybody negate you on the basis of where you come from, nor allow the state to determine what is legitimate or illegitimate. It doesn't matter if you're mama and daddy's mistake down by the lake. You are significant because of who God says you are. And if the Imago Dei is located in your person, then you are special and you are precious because you are a child of God. Don't let anybody tell you you're not significant because of your past or your background. When the state gets to decide to determine what is legitimate and what is illegitimate, Dan Williams has a problem. Because the only person that can assign legitimacy, worth, value is God. And if you came through the womb and you breathing today, it doesn't matter where you came from or how you got here. You are valuable and you are precious in his sight. And don't let anybody make you feel or think differently. He's the son of Mary. And it's strange because someone told us that familiarity breeds contempt. Philip Brooks, in his work, corrected this and said, familiarity breeds contempt, but only in contemptible people. You see, really, the more you live with somebody over the course of time, the deeper that love can grow. You have a friendship of 30, 40 years, and you get to know them, and that relationship is deepened and it grows. Here in this text, they think they know what they don't know. And because he appears to be common, they can't see that he's really a king. He's really Messiah. Jesus says a prophet is not honored. A prophet is honored everywhere except in his hometown. Listen, they don't even consider him a prophet. And when they say marvel at his work and at his wisdom, it's because they are marveling at what they really don't know. The text says they were amazed at his wisdom, they were amazed at his ability to perform miracles, but they haven't experienced that. The reason I know they haven't experienced that is because the text says he could do no mighty miracles and works there. And so they obviously are talking about what they've heard, not what they have experienced. And the thing I like about Jesus is that Jesus is perplexed by it, but he's not paralyzed by it. You see, the people here in Nazareth, their refusal to acknowledge greatness in what is common doesn't say anything about Jesus. It says something about them. See, the problem ain't Jesus. Their inability to see him and recognize him speaks volumes about them, not him. When I was a boy, if you grew up in Philadelphia, you get to go to the Franklin Institute, the Philadelphia Art Museum, and a host of other places like a dozen times before you graduate high school. And so I've been in and out of the art museum so many times in my life until if somebody said you want to go now, I would say no. But when I was a kid, I would go on these field trips, bus trips, and I went on those field trips and bus trips at the time when you got off the bus, your parents were waiting for the report from the teacher about how you behaved on the field trip. And aside, went on a field trip when I was a little boy one time, and my teacher, Miss Nakawatase, third grade teacher, started telling my mother this swelling report of my behavior. And my mother said, "Are you sure you're talking about Danny? Are you sure?" Oh, yes, he was so well behaved. And my mother was like, "Are you sure? I'm Mrs. Williams, do you?" The worst one has some good in them. She would say to me, "Hey, how did it go? How did you enjoy the art museum?" And in my mind, I was like, we saw some pictures. I didn't know I was looking at Tanner's works. I didn't know that I was looking at Dickinson's works. I didn't know that I was looking at Renoir's works. I didn't know that I was looking at the works of Horace Pippin. It's because when you don't have eyes to see, you can reduce greatness to something that's common. All I said was I saw some pictures, but I didn't realize that what I saw really were masterpieces. And sometimes people who don't have right vision will look at you and just see what's common, but they won't see a masterpiece. And when you look at the people of God, what you're looking at are masterpieces. You're looking at people who were broken and put back together again. And people who had no hope who now have hope. You're looking at works of art and creativity that only God can do in the soul of a person. And when you look at somebody, you reduce them to the mundane. You're actually looking at something that is a masterpiece. They can't see who he is. And let me offer this. Sometimes the poverty you experience is not a result of your condition. It's a result of your vision. You see, cities like Coatesville and Philadelphia, New York, and other places where there are urban centers, they don't all just suffer because of a condition of poverty. They suffer because of an impoverished imagination and a poverty of ideas. Not their condition. It's because they can't see beyond the mundane. And they can't see themselves ever doing anything significant. And what you need is a God that can work in your soul to help you see who you really are and who you really can be, which will enable you to stop accepting just anything. Because you see yourself through a different lens. And Jesus says, I can only do a few works here, and the text is instructive. Verse 6, and he was amazed at their unbelief. Now, the thing that affects me when I read this is that I'm trying to figure out how in the world do you amaze Jesus Christ? I could understand if anybody else said it, if Michael had said it, if Gabriel had said it, but I can't understand how do you amaze Jesus? It's strange because if you've been tracking the narrative, when Jesus was in the other places, Gerasenes, when he was healing, there were people who ran to Jesus. This is Jesus who has received worship from angelic hosts. This is Jesus whom the demonic forces have identified as the Son of God. This is Jesus whose pigs, having been demonized, drowned themselves. And pigs and pagans recognize Christ when the people of Nazareth, his hometown, can't. I mean, it is paralyzing to think that these people refuse to believe, and it's paralyzing to think that Jesus is now amazed at their unbelief. Because if you really want to impress God, you can do it in two ways. You can do it by believing and trusting in him, or by rejecting him completely. And the same God who allows your heart to beat has measured the molecules of air you'll breathe, will be amazed at your rejection of his grace. And Jesus in this text is completely amazed at the way they have rejected him. Now, good people, I want you to be clear about something if you're going to live in this world. Rejection will not only be true for Jesus, rejection will be true for you. If you're going to live this life in this world, you might as well grow accustomed to being rejected. I have a friend of mine who said to me, Dan, you know, I've been working with a therapist, and I realized I have a fear of rejection. And I said, well, you better get used to it. Because if you're going to keep living in this world, you're going to be rejected. And what you have to do as good parents who love Christ and are framing your children from the Word of God about how to live in this world, you want to help them to understand that rejection is something everybody will have to experience. One of the things that bothers me now about the way we do sports in our culture for babies, for children, is that it's broken and it's flawed and it doesn't prepare them for the real world. I have a neighbor whose child plays in a little league, and he was explaining to me that the way it works is that on her baseball team, nobody ever strikes out. That they pitch the ball so slow that you are obligated to hit it. And in fact, sometimes it appears as if they're throwing the ball at the bat. Because on their team, they don't want any player to ever strike out. Another one told me that there is a rule in their school where whoever comes out for the team, they automatically stay on the team. I said, why is that? He said, because we don't cut anybody. If you come out for the team, you will not be cut. I said, they'll get a uniform? He said, yes. I said, will they play? Maybe not, but they'll be on the team. Because our policy is we don't cut anybody. I'm here to tell you that in this world, you strike out. In this world, you get cut. In this world, people hurt your feelings. In this world, everybody doesn't love you. In this world, you will be rejected. In this world, you will be misunderstood. And if you don't prepare yourself to live in this world, you are not preparing to live. I'm glad, though, that there is a Christ who even when I'm rejected understands. Even when I'm cut, he knows what I feel. Even when I've been fired unjustifiably, he knows the pain that I feel because he's been there. This is foolishness. To develop a generation that is somehow anesthetized to pain, that somehow getting your feelings hurt is not proper in a world that does nothing more than try to crush the life out of you. How can you endorse that? How could you believe that somehow I don't strike out, I don't get cut, I don't get hurt in this world, especially as you've lived in this world as grown African American people? What you know is that this world will grind you up, chew you up, and spit you out. But if you know the one who can raise up those who are down, and the one who takes the mundane and makes them magnificent, you can make it. He understands what this is like. And when you are evaluating people, never evaluate them on the basis of their externals, because you don't know what people have been through. All you hypersensitive church people, grow up. Sometimes people walk by you on Sunday morning, and it's not because they're ignoring you. They didn't see you. They got burdens and weight and problems and issues, and you are the last thing on their mind. Don't walk around talking about nobody spoke to me, nobody said. No, they never saw you, because if you knew the hell they was going through, you would know why they didn't say anything. Newsflash, if they didn't speak to you, why didn't you speak to them? You just as jacked up as you can be. You can't evaluate people on the basis of what you see. You don't know where they've been. You don't know what their week has been like. There are some people sitting next to you who have been going through hell all week long, and if it weren't for the grace of God, they could have made it out this morning. They can barely smile, stand up and raise their hand, and when you see them, you ought to embrace them and say, my brother, my sister, I'm so glad that you're here. Let's worship God together. What I like about this is that God has this way of taking the common and then using the common in order to manifest his power and his glory. That's the real value of 2 Corinthians 4 that Pastor Smith read this morning, Pastor Marshall read this morning. Because the writer says, for we have this treasure in these earthen vessels, so that the excellency of God's power might be seen to be his and not ours. It's because what God does exclusively is work through the rejected, work through the common, work through the criticized in order to manifest his glory. He says we have this treasure in these earthen vessels because from God's perspective, all you and I will ever be are cracked pots. The only thing we can ever be is an earthen vessel. But when you read the Old Testament antiquity, you realize that in the ancient world, they would store treasure in earthen vessels. And the only way you could get to the treasure is you had to crack the pot. The only way the power of God can be seen is in some crackpots. And the only way that God can get the glory is through some crackpots. It means you can't steal his glory and boast about how great you are. All you can do is say, yes, I'm broken, and I'm flawed, but there is a God that has chosen to manifest his power through my life. And baby, you look at me now, but you should see what I used to be. I was a work undone. I was a wretch indeed, but thanks be to God and his unspeakable gift and unspeakable grace, I am not what I used to be, and the power of God is emanating through my cracks, so give him glory. Are you glad this morning that all you are is a vessel for the glory of God to be realized and seen by the world? Yes, I haven't always been up, I've been down, but thank you, God, that you still manifest your power through a crackpot. Don't let anybody reduce you to a place where you don't recognize and identify the manifested grace of God in your life. Not one of us is as sharp as we appear to be. Not one of us is as slick as we make ourselves out to be. We look good today, but it wasn't always like that. And it won't be like that tomorrow in some cases. The truth is, if the Holy Ghost was to undress us, we all be ducking and dodging. But we realize that there's a grace of God that, when recognized, allows us to celebrate even what those call common. And you see, the good news about Jesus is that he was rejected, knows exactly what you feel. He was ridiculed, knows exactly what you feel. Was in a place where he couldn't be recognized as king, knows exactly what you feel. And sometimes the people you're closest to can hurt you the greatest. It was his hometown. Rejection anywhere else would have been understood, but not in his own hometown. And this Christ went to a cross for you. This Christ died for you. And this Christ is astounded and amazed at those of us who refuse to believe in spite of all he's done. And my prayer is that we would recognize the grace of God, submit to it, celebrate it, and serve him.